In 1989, a man named Elwood Edwards sat at home in North Carolina, turned on a cassette recorder, and delivered 4 simple phrases for a $200 payment. Welcome. You've got mail. Files done. Goodbye. His wife, Karen, worked for the company behind the project and suggested that his voice be used for the recording. A decade later, the simple phrase, "You've got mail," had become one of the most recognizable sounds of the internet, playing nearly 35 million times every single day for users of the largest online service in America. The company that once paid Elwood Edwards just $200 for a small cassette recording would eventually reach a peak valuation of $222 billion. America Online made its debut on the NASDAQ on March 19, 1992, launching at $11.50 per share with a market value of around $62 million. By December 1999, that figure had exploded to an astonishing $222 billion. Just 3 years later, the company reported a record-breaking net loss of $98.7 billion, the biggest single-year corporate loss ever recorded in American history. By the fall of 2023, the former AOL headquarters at 22,000 AOL Way in Dulles, Virginia, was being torn apart by demolition crews. 3 office buildings and 2 massive parking garages were turned into piles of debris, making room for a new data center. The company that once connected millions of Americans to the online world had effectively vanished from the landscape, and the story of how it collapsed begins, as many technology stories do, with a small startup that seemed unlikely to survive. We explore the companies that built the digital world, from the hardware that powered it to the servers, systems, and engineers who brought it to life. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe and hit like, because the rise of this company is every bit as remarkable and dramatic as the collapse that followed. Steve Case was born in Honolulu in 1958. During his teenage years, he discovered Alvin Toffler's The Third Wave, a book that imagined a coming digital transformation long before the internet became a part of everyday life. The vision stayed with him, impossible to ignore, and shaped the way he saw the future. He came to believe that computers would one day link everyday people together in ways that the traditional telephone never could. That belief did not come with a clear job opportunity or an established industry to enter. He graduated from Williams College in 1980, and with no internet companies waiting for a young entrepreneur to join, he started his career in marketing. First at Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati, then at Pizza Hut in Wichita, Kansas. He was selling everyday consumer products in the heart of America's Midwest while holding on to a vision of a connected world that had not yet been built. In 1983, his brother Dan, an investment banker, invited him to the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. That was where Case crossed paths with William Von Meister, a serial entrepreneur behind a company called Control Video Corporation. CVC had only one offering, a service known as GameLine Music, which allowed Atari 2,600 owners to download video games through a phone connection for about $1 per game. Case joined the company as a marketing consultant, music, and relocated to Washington, D.C. Just a few months later, Control Video was on the edge of collapse. But from the remains of that failed venture emerged the team and ideas that would create something far bigger. Jim Kimsey was a West Point graduate, a decorated airborne ranger, and a veteran of 3 combat tours, including 2 in Vietnam. His former West Point classmate, Frank Caulfield, a partner at the venture capital firm Kleiner Perkins, brought him into Control Video as a manufacturing consultant. Kimsey was not a technologist or a computer expert. He was a leader who knew how to manage chaos, stabilize a failing operation, and keep a company alive when it was on the brink of collapse. And that was exactly what he did. The third key figure was Mark Serif, a young engineer who created the technical foundation that made dial-up networking possible. He built the system that connected a personal computer, a phone line, and a modem into a gateway to something far bigger than the space around you. In 1985, the 3 men rebuilt what was left of Control Video and transformed it into a new company called Quantum Computer Services, operating out of offices in Vienna, Virginia. Some accounts trace the company's origins back to 1983, when Control Video first brought Steve Case on board. But this history marks 1985 as the true beginning, the moment Quantum was intentionally created from the remains of a failed venture and given a second chance. The company's first major product was Q-Link, an online service built for the Commodore 64 computer. In 1985, only about 3% of Americans had access to online services, and even those users spent just around an hour per week connected. The market Steve Case was trying to reach was almost non-existent. For 7 years, the company pushed forward one difficult step at a time. Quantum expanded its services to IBM and Apple computers, watched Apple leave to create its own online platform, and survived through determination and limited funding. Case later recalled that during the late 1980s, there were moments when even his own parents encouraged him to abandon the idea and find a more stable career. There were employee cuts, failed partnerships, and periods when the company was dangerously close to running out of money. But they kept showing up, kept rebuilding, and kept moving forward. In 1991, the company took on a new name, America Online. 1 year later, AOL entered the public market, raising $66 million through its initial offering. At the time, the service had around 200,000 subscribers. AOL ranked third among online providers, trailing behind CompuServe and Prodigy, and outside the small world of technology, almost nobody knew it existed. Then Jan Brandt entered the picture. Hired as AOL's chief marketing officer in 1993, Brandt embraced a simple idea that matched the company's mission from the beginning. Rather than pour money into television advertising like Prodigy, she decided to place the service directly in front of potential customers through direct mail. Her first major campaign sent out free trial discs, 3.5-inch floppy disks containing AOL software, and an offer for complimentary online hours to carefully selected homes across the country. The campaign had a budget of $250,000 and generated a response rate of 10%. In an industry where a 2% or 3% return was considered a success, reaching 10% was almost unheard of. People were not simply testing the service, they were signing up, staying, and becoming paying customers. So Brandt continued pushing the strategy, and what followed became one of the most aggressive marketing campaigns in American business history. The discs spread everywhere, from people's mailboxes to Blockbuster stores, from magazine inserts to cereal packaging, from Barnes and Noble checkout counters to shipments of frozen Omaha steaks. Brandt described the approach as carpet bombing, and the scale of the campaign was almost impossible to comprehend. At the peak of the campaign, Brandt said that nearly half of all compact discs produced worldwide featured the AOL logo. Over a 13-year period, from 1993 through 2006, more than 1 billion discs were sent out across North America. AOL spent about $35 to gain each new subscriber, but the average customer remained with the service for roughly 25 months and brought in around $350 in total lifetime revenue. At its fastest growth point, AOL was adding a new customer every 6 seconds. The subscriber base exploded from just 200,000 users in 1992 to more than 10 million by the end of the decade. The growth was powered by a simple disc that appeared everywhere, in mailboxes, inside cereal boxes, and tucked into Blockbuster rental bags, sometimes all within the same week. Today, one of those discs is preserved in the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, recognized as a symbol of how the internet first entered millions of American households. In December 1996, AOL made a major change, replacing its hourly pricing model with a flat monthly subscription fee of $19.95. The sudden shift overwhelmed the system almost instantly. Millions of customers attempted to log in at the same time, causing networks to collapse under the demand. Connection failures became routine, frustration spread, and thousands of users canceled their accounts. Steve Case appeared publicly, assuring customers that the company was working around the clock to solve the crisis. They eventually solved the problems. Within 3 years, AOL's subscriber base had surpassed 10 million users, and the company moved into a new campus in Dulles, Virginia, to accommodate expansion that showed no signs of slowing down. But behind the scenes, inside the rapidly growing organization, another force was taking shape, something the executives never planned for and, at first, actively tried to eliminate: In 1994, an engineer named Barry Appleman came up with an idea that would completely change the way people connected online. It was a simple contact list that showed, in real time, which of your friends were currently signed in and available. He called it the buddy list. Today, the idea seems obvious because nearly every social platform uses some version of it. But in 1994, the concept was something entirely new. Appleman brought in two fellow engineers, Eric Bosco, a browser developer, and Jerry Harris, a client software programmer. Together, the three built an early messaging prototype using aging Hewlett-Packard servers they received through a favor from the person running AOL's data center. The project had no official approval. Company leadership had no idea it existed. They built it late at night, outside normal work hours, because they believed they were creating something important. When they finally showed the completed product to company leadership, the reaction was far from positive. Executives wanted the project shut down, and according to Appleman, some even considered firing him for creating it without permission. The problem came down to one core issue. AOL's business depended on subscription revenue, and Appleman had built a free communication tool that even non-subscribers could access. To management, giving away a valuable feature for free looked like an attack on the company's own business model from within. But the product team refused to let it disappear, and after enough pressure, executives finally changed course. AOL Instant Messenger launched quietly in May 1997. Within 4 years, it had grown to 36 million active users. By the middle of the 2000s, AM had captured 52% of the online messaging market across North America. The away message became a predecessor to the modern status update. The buddy list evolved into today's friends and follower systems. The familiar login chime became the foundation for the notification sounds that now define digital communication. Barry Appleman, the engineer who nearly lost his job for creating the platform, would later become the inventor behind 77 patents. AM became the most influential product AOL ever built, yet the company never generated direct revenue from it. That overlooked mistake, unnoticed in the moment, became an early warning of the larger problems that would eventually follow. AOL's stock continued climbing without needing any revenue from AM. The internet revolution had become unstoppable, and AOL was positioned right at the center of it. The company then reached a historic agreement with Microsoft. Internet Explorer was integrated as the default browser within AOL software, while AOL was included with Windows installations, putting the AOL icon directly in front of millions of new computer users across America. CompuServe, once the dominant name in online services, was absorbed in 1998. That same year, AOL made another major move, purchasing the browser company Netscape for $4.2 billion. In 1999, it added MapQuest to its growing empire in a deal worth $1.1 billion. By 1997, nearly half of all American households connected to the internet were using AOL as their gateway online. The company's stock had climbed more than 700 times higher than its original IPO price. And by December 1999, AOL reached its highest point with a market value of $222 billion. A company that had been valued at just $62 million only 7 years earlier was now worth more than some of America's biggest industrial giants, including General Motors, Ford, and Boeing. Steve Case recognized two critical realities. He understood that AOL's massive valuation was being fueled in large part by the dot-com boom, a market frenzy that could not continue forever. He also saw the next technological shift approaching: broadband. Cable modems and DSL connections were preparing to replace dial-up, and when the internet became permanently connected, millions of users would no longer need AOL software or its monthly subscription to access the web. The opportunity to turn an inflated stock price into lasting value was disappearing quickly. On January 10, 2000, just 2 months before the NASDAQ reached its historic high beginning a collapse that would continue for years, Steve Case and Time Warner CEO Gerald Levin appeared together to announce the biggest corporate merger America had ever seen. AOL, a dial-up internet company that was less than 15 years old, would merge with Time Warner, the media giant behind HBO, CNN, Warner Brothers, Time Incorporated, and one of the largest cable networks in the United States, in a deal valued at $182 billion. The newly combined company was projected to have a total value of around $350 billion. AOL shareholders would control 55% of the merged organization, meaning the young internet company, not the legendary media empire, would hold the majority stake. It was the boldest attempt ever made to bring entertainment, media, and technology together under one roof. And within just 3 years, that historic gamble would lead to the largest corporate financial loss ever recorded in American business history. At its height, AOL had grown to more than 20 million paying customers. Around half of all internet activity in America passed through its systems. "You've got mail" had become more than a simple alert. It became a phrase people used, a part of everyday culture, and even the name of a 1998 romantic comedy starring Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan. For millions of households across the country, that familiar voice was the sound of the internet coming to life. By 2001, AM had attracted more than 36 million active users and controlled over half of the entire instant messaging market. AOL wasn't simply another service on the internet. For millions of Americans, AOL was the internet. It handled your email, your chat rooms, your news, the weather, your search engine, your buddy list, and even the installation disk that got you online in the first place. Years before Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram existed, AOL had already introduced many of the ideas that would define social media. Online communities, instant messaging, screen name identities, status updates, and digital profiles. Everything existed inside a carefully controlled walled garden connected through a noisy dial-up modem and unlocked with a $19 monthly subscription. Then broadband began changing everything. Cable internet and DSL brought fast, always-on connections that no longer required the familiar dial-up tones, a closed online ecosystem, or a monthly subscription to a single gateway. AOL's entire business model had been built around serving as the main entry point to the internet for millions of Americans. But once people could connect directly to the web, that gateway stopped being an advantage. The front door that had once welcomed everyone in was quickly turning into a barrier that people wanted to bypass. The merger took nearly a full year to receive approval. The Federal Trade Commission closely examined the union between the nation's largest internet company and one of its biggest media and cable giants. At the same time, the Federal Communications Commission questioned AOL's overwhelming control of the instant messaging market. Regulators approved the merger only after attaching a series of conditions. But while lawyers, executives, and government agencies worked through months of paperwork, the world that had made the merger seem unstoppable was already falling apart beneath their feet. In March 2000, the NASDAQ reached its peak before plunging into a collapse that would last for more than 2 years. The flood of .com advertising money that had fueled AOL's explosive rise disappeared almost overnight. By the time the merger officially closed on January 11, 2001, the very asset Steve Case had relied on to acquire Time Warner, AOL's sky-high stock price, was already losing value at an alarming pace. The deal had finally become official, but the financial foundation it was built on was already crumbling. You can interpret that decision in 2 completely different ways, and a fair history has to acknowledge both. One perspective argues that Case understood the future before most people did. He knew dial-up was fading, that broadband would eventually destroy AOL's core subscription business, and that the company needed to make its move while its value was still high. Turning AOL's inflated stock into a lasting asset may have been the most logical option available. From this point of view, the merger was not an act of arrogance, but an emergency maneuver, a desperate attempt to leave a collapsing structure before it came down around him, even if it meant jumping into another one that was already unstable. The other interpretation is far less forgiving. It argues that Case used a currency inflated by the .com bubble to buy a company whose executives failed to understand what they were surrendering, that the people who designed the merger became convinced by their own vision of a future where media and technology would seamlessly combine. The reality likely sits somewhere between those two explanations. But the cruelest part is that it may not have changed the outcome. The timing was simply impossible to survive. The two companies never truly became one. Time Warner leaders, many of whom had spent decades building empires in television, publishing, and Hollywood, saw the AOL executives as overconfident outsiders whose success was driven more by a soaring stock valuation than real profits. Meanwhile, the AOL side viewed Time Warner's leadership as outdated guardians of an old media world, unable to understand the speed, scale, and disruption the internet was about to unleash. CNN pushed back against giving AOL special treatment for its content. Warner Music resisted efforts to move aggressively into digital distribution. The cable division, the very part of the company that controlled the broadband infrastructure AOL needed to survive, dragged its feet on attempts to combine AOL's services with high-speed internet access. The grand vision of convergence, a seamless union between media and technology, never became reality. What emerged instead was gridlock, internal distrust, and financial damage on a scale the industry had rarely seen before. In 2002, AOL Time Warner revealed a staggering annual loss of $98.7 billion. The company was forced to erase nearly $99 billion in goodwill from the value of the merger. That one figure, $98.7 billion, became the largest yearly corporate loss ever recorded by an American company. Gerald Levin, the executive who had pushed the merger forward despite resistance from within, stepped down in December 2001, later describing his leadership of the company as a failure. Steve Case lost his position as chairman in 2003. That same year, the company removed AOL from its name and returned to the simpler identity of Time Warner. It was almost as if deleting 3 letters from the logo could somehow erase the damage, the failure, and the history that came with them. Ted Turner, the media mogul who had sold Turner Broadcasting System to Time Warner in 1995 and became the company's largest individual shareholder, saw his personal fortune collapse by nearly 80%. The loss amounted to roughly $8 billion in wealth. Across the newly combined company, thousands of employees watched their retirement savings, tied heavily to AOL Time Warner stock, shrink dramatically as the value that once represented a new media empire disappeared. The thousands of AOL employees who had become paper millionaires in Loudoun County before the crash, the engineers, developers, and early employees whose stock options had turned into life-changing fortunes, watched those fortunes vanish within a matter of months. That reality is worth stating without exaggeration because that is exactly what happened. And no explanation, no financial breakdown, and no historical analysis can fully capture what it was like to watch everything disappear. What came next was a gradual breakup carried out through a series of deals, each one marking another step in the company's decline. In 2009, Time Warner finally separated AOL into its own independent company. By the time of the split, AOL's market value had fallen to just $3.3 billion, a staggering 97% collapse from its peak valuation of $222 billion. In 2015, Verizon Communications purchased AOL for $4.4 billion, betting that AOL's advertising technology could become the foundation of a new digital media empire. Verizon later combined AOL with Yahoo under a new division called Oath, a name that suggested ambition but ultimately became associated with another massive loss. In 2018, Verizon wrote down $4.6 billion from the value of the business. Tim Armstrong, the executive brought in to lead the combined operation, departed that same year. In 2021, Verizon finally walked away from the experiment, selling both AOL and Yahoo together to private equity firm Apollo Global Management for a combined $5 billion. That figure represented roughly half of what Verizon had originally spent acquiring the two. Companies separately, the once separate internet giants were then brought together under the Yahoo name, a final chapter in the long decline of two brands that had once defined the online world. In 2025, Italian software company Bending Spoons purchased AOL from Apollo Global Management for a reported $1.5 billion. Follow the numbers, and the collapse becomes almost impossible to ignore. A company once valued at $222 billion at its height was now worth less than 1% of that peak. The same company that had used its inflated stock to acquire Time Warner in a $182 billion deal had just 2 decades later become an acquisition target itself, sold for less than the cost of the massive CD distribution campaign that helped create its empire. In the fall of 2023, demolition crews arrived at 22,000 AOL Way in Sterling, Virginia, beginning the final physical erasure of a once iconic internet headquarters. They brought down 3 office buildings, 2 large parking structures, a mail processing center, and the pedestrian bridge that once crossed Pacific Boulevard, linking parts of a campus that had been filled with thousands of employees building what many considered the gateway to the online world. The cafeteria's kitchen equipment was donated to the Dulles South Soup Kitchen. The concrete was crushed, recycled, and given a second life elsewhere. The 43-acre property was cleared to make room for a massive hyperscale data center built in the very region AOL helped transform into a technology hub filled with skilled workers and fiber optic networks. Loudoun County's famous Data Center Alley. Today, that corridor carries an estimated 70% of the world's internet traffic. AOL itself has disappeared, but the digital infrastructure that grew around it now supports the modern internet every second of every day. But the legacy AOL created did not disappear when the buildings came down. AOL Mail continued on, still serving roughly 30 million monthly active users. Millions of people are still connected through email addresses they created decades ago, screen names chosen 20 or 25 years earlier that somehow became digital identities they never abandoned. The away message a teenager carefully crafted in 2002, rewriting it again and again before stepping away for dinner, was an early version of what would become the tweet, the status update, and the story post. The AIM Buddy list evolved into the friends and followers list that defined nearly every social platform that came after it. Even the simple notification sound, that small digital tap telling you someone was reaching out, can trace its roots back to the familiar door-opening alert of AIM. Mark Zuckerberg has acknowledged that AIM shaped the way he thought about communication and messaging on Facebook. Every group conversation, every Discord community, every read receipt that appears on a smartphone today carries a small piece of the idea that began with Barry Appleman's work on borrowed servers in 1994, a project he believed was worth building, even when his own company told him to walk away from it. One of John Brandt's AOL trial discs now rests behind glass at the Smithsonian, preserved as a symbol of the moment when everyday Americans first encountered the online world. The Internet Archive continues gathering and preserving old AOL CDs, treating them almost like artifacts from a lost civilization, fragments left behind from a digital empire that rose, transformed the world, and eventually disappeared. And for millions of people, just hearing those familiar words is enough to bring back the sound instantly. In 1989, Elwood Edwards sat in his living room and recorded 4 simple phrases onto a cassette tape, earning just $200 for the job. His wife had discovered that the company was searching for a voice, and he volunteered. He hit record, spoke the lines, and delivered the tape without knowing what would come next. He had no idea those words would be played billions of times, that they would appear in a Tom Hanks movie, that his voice would become instantly recognizable around the world, or that the company behind those 4 phrases would eventually reach a valuation of $222 billion before disappearing so completely that even its headquarters would be erased from the landscape. Edwards spent his final years working at a Cleveland television station, making a memorable appearance on The Tonight Show, where he delivered the famous greeting to a cheering studio audience. For a period of time, he also worked as a rideshare driver. He passed away on November 5th, 2024, just 1 day before his 75th birthday, at his home in North Carolina. By then, the AOL campus, where his voice had once traveled through the company's servers, was already gone. The data center rising on that same land would move unimaginable amounts of internet traffic, an internet that no longer needed a welcome message, a dial-up connection, or a single gateway to let people in. AOL did not fail because it misunderstood the internet. AOL became the internet for an entire generation, until the internet evolved beyond the need for a single entrance. If you ever had an AOL screen name, if you remember the sound of that modem connecting and the nervous pause while you waited to get online, if you spent time perfecting an away message or found an AOL disk tucked inside a cereal box one morning, leave a comment below. Share the screen name you remember, the year you joined, and whether that familiar voice still plays in your head. The people who were there, the ones who actually logged on and lived through it, understand what AOL created and what disappeared in a way the people who signed the deals never could. Subscribe, because this is where we uncover and preserve the stories of the companies that built the digital world we live in today. Another chapter from the rise and fall of an American technology empire is coming next, and you will not want to miss the final moments of how it all unfolds.